Look at the private jets. Look at the sprawling gated estates. Look at the stadium-sized arenas. When you see a megachurch pastor living a lifestyle that rivals Hollywood celebrities and Wall Street CEOs, the first question almost everyone asks is, how do they get away with it? But that is the wrong question. The real question you should be asking is, why is the government letting them do it completely for free? Every single year, billions of dollars flow into the modern megachurch industry. People donate their hard-earned paychecks, their pensions, and their savings, believing they are funding community outreach and spiritual growth. And yet, thanks to a deeply hidden set of loopholes in the United States tax code, the organizations receiving these billions do not pay a single cent in federal income taxes. You see, churches are classified as 501c3 nonprofits. But unlike almost every other secular charity in America, churches are granted a massive, invisible shield. They are legally exempt from filing an annual Form 990 with the IRS. What does that mean? It means they can take in hundreds of millions of dollars without ever disclosing their staff pay, their board membership, or their funding details to the public or the government. It is complete financial darkness, and it is 100% legal. But the system goes even deeper. How do the pastors personally get so incredibly rich? It's called the parsonage exemption. This obscure, decades-old tax loophole allows ministers to exclude their housing costs from their federal income taxes. And the most shocking part? There is absolutely no monetary cap on this exemption. American taxpayers are essentially subsidizing the multi-million-dollar estates of the wealthiest preachers in the country. Even if the IRS wanted to investigate these empires, their hands are tied by the law. Federal regulations dictate that a high-ranking IRS official must explicitly prove a reasonable belief of a tax violation before they can even begin an audit of a church. It is a protective hurdle much higher than the standard for any normal taxpayer. In this documentary, we are going to follow the money. We will break down exactly how these loopholes were created, the extreme ways they are being exploited today by the most famous preachers in America, and how the megachurch industry legally hides billions of dollars in plain sight. Welcome to the billion-dollar tax haven. Let's dig in. The rise. There's a side of faith that most people never see. Not the sermons, not the choirs, not the quiet, desperate moments of prayer in a wooden pew. It exists behind the glaring studio lights, behind the broadcast cameras, and behind the polished corporate auditorium walls. It's a world where human devotion meets ruthless organization, where spiritual influence meets multi-million-dollar infrastructure, and where faith quietly, but deliberately, became an industry. To understand how we arrived at the modern tax-free megachurch economy, an economy that moves billions of dollars a year in complete darkness, we have to rewind. We have to go back to a time before the private jets, before the 15,000 square foot tax-free mansions, before the stadium-sized arenas packed with screaming followers. The mid-20th century was a time of unprecedented transformation in American life. Following the end of the Second World War, the United States entered an era of explosive economic optimism. The middle class was booming. Suburbs were expanding outward, swallowing up farmland and turning it into manicured lawns and paved driveways. And with this new suburban sprawl came a shift in American religious life. Communities that had once gathered in modest neighborhood halls were beginning to expand. Pews grew longer, offerings grew larger, but even the most ambitious local pastors were still limited by a fundamental law of physics. Your influence could only reach as far as the sound of your voice. If a person wasn't physically sitting in your building, they couldn't hear your message. And more importantly, they couldn't put money into your offering plate. It was the dawn of the megachurch era, though few could have recognized the monster it would eventually become. And then, a glowing box arrived in the American living room. In the 1950s, television sets shifted from being a luxury novelty to an absolute fixture in American homes. And with that small screen came a revolutionary, unprecedented opportunity. the ability to broadcast a single message to millions of people at the exact same time. Now, religious broadcasting wasn't entirely new. In the 1920s and 30s, preachers had utilized radio to reach nationwide audiences. But radio was a theater of the mind. Television was entirely different. Television allowed a preacher to look directly into the camera lens, to make eye contact with a viewer sitting hundreds of miles away, and to forge a deeply personal, parasocial connection. However, getting onto television in the 1950s wasn't easy for the fiery, independent evangelists. During the early days of broadcasting, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, required television networks to provide free public service programming to the country. To fulfill this obligation, networks handed over free airtime to established mainline religious denominations. The programs were calm, broadly representative, and decidedly non-controversial. The aggressive, independent fundamentalist preachers were essentially locked out of the system. But in 1960, everything changed. A quiet, bureaucratic decision was made that would inadvertently give birth to a billion-dollar empire. Under intense pressure, the FCC altered its policy. They ruled that local television stations could now sell airtime for religious programming and still receive their public interest credit from the government. Suddenly, the floodgates opened. Local stations realized they could cash in on this new demand, selling time blocks to the highest bidder. And the independent evangelists, who had spent decades perfecting the art of aggressive, emotional fundraising in canvas revival tents, were ready with open checkbooks. They didn't just want to preach, they wanted to build empires. And the pioneers of this new electronic church understood exactly what had to be done. The reach of their voice was no longer restricted by geography. A sermon that once required an audience to be present in the same room could now influence viewers across the entire nation. To fully grasp how the modern megachurch was engineered, we have to look at the man who literally built the blueprint. A man who looked at the glowing screen of a television set and saw the future of religious wealth. His name was Rex Humbard. Rex Humbard was a fiery evangelist from Arkansas, born into a family of traveling circuit-riding preachers. For years, he traveled the country, setting up canvas tents and holding revivals. But his life and the course of American religion changed forever when he was passing through Akron, Ohio. Walking past the department store, Humbard noticed a massive crowd of people huddled together on the sidewalk. They weren't looking at a preacher. They were staring through the store window, utterly hypnotized by a Cleveland Indians baseball game playing on a television set. Humbard saw the raw magnetic power of the cathode ray tube. He realized, in that exact moment, that the future of evangelism wasn't in canvas tents. It was on the screen. In 1952, Humbard settled in Akron and began broadcasting his church services on local television, becoming the first evangelist in America to have a weekly, nationwide television program. But Humbard didn't just put a camera in a normal church. He fundamentally redesigned what a church was supposed to be. In 1958, he spent an astonishing $4 million to build a massive 5,400-seat arena in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. He named it the Cathedral of Tomorrow. This was not a place of quiet reflection. It was a state-of-the-art television production facility disguised as a house of worship. The building was specifically designed to accommodate heavy television equipment, sweeping camera angles, a massive chorus, and theatrical lighting. It featured velvet drapes, a hydraulic stage that could raise and lower, and a dominant, unobstructed circular auditorium. Humbard was no longer just a pastor, he was an executive producer, and the results were staggering. At the peak of its popularity, Humbard's Cathedral of Tomorrow program was broadcast on over 600 stations globally, reaching an estimated audience of 20 million viewers. And with that massive reach came the money. Donations skyrocketed. Viewers from across the country, feeling a deeply personal connection to Humbard through their television screens, began mailing in their hard-earned money. The financial model was incredibly simple, yet devastatingly powerful. Television airtime cost money. To pay for the airtime, The preacher had to ask the audience for donations. Those donations paid for the broadcast, which reached even more people who sent in even more donations. Influence attracted followers. Followers provided resources. Resources funded expansion. And expansion amplified the influence. It was an infinite, self-sustaining loop of wealth. But television was expensive, and soon, simple donations weren't enough. The hunger for expansion pushed these early empires into legally questionable territory. To fund the massive costs of his broadcasting empire, Rex Humbard didn't just ask for offerings, he entered the world of high finance. In 1959, Humbard's ministry began issuing its own bonds and promissory notes to its followers. He formed a traveling squad of 20 salesmen, many of them ministers in his own church, who traveled across 47 states, convincing small-time investors and faithful viewers to hand over their savings. They raised a staggering $12 million. There was only one problem. The securities were completely unregistered, and they were not sold through licensed brokers. Humbard's financial empire came under the aggressive scrutiny of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and officials in at least 6 states eventually had to step in to halt the sale of the securities. It was an early warning sign of what was to come. The church was no longer a spiritual sanctuary. It was a multinational corporation, dealing in complex financial instruments, unregulated securities, and millions of dollars in untaxed revenue. And while Rex Humbard built the physical infrastructure of the modern megachurch, another man was quietly engineering its psychological core. A man who would invent a theological concept so powerfully manipulative, it is still used by the wealthiest pastors in America today to extract billions of dollars from the public. His name was Oral Roberts. Born into extreme poverty in Oklahoma in 1918, Roberts began his career in the late 1940s as a traveling Pentecostal faith healer. He would set up enormous canvas tents across the country, preaching a highly emotional, charismatic message. He promised miraculous, faith-based cures to believers, claiming he received direct communications from God. But like Humbard, Roberts saw the true potential of the camera. In the 1950s, he transitioned his massive tent revivals onto television, bringing the frantic, sweat-soaked energy of Pentecostal healing directly into the conservative American living room. Oral Roberts was a masterful showman, but his true genius lay in his understanding of human psychology and consumer culture. He realized early on that people weren't just giving money to keep the lights on, they were buying into a narrative. During the mid-20th century, traditional Protestant Christianity largely taught that money and wealth were secondary to spiritual purity. The Bible, after all, famously warned that the love of money was the root of all evil. But Oral Roberts flipped that script entirely. He became the first mainstream proponent of what is now known as the prosperity gospel. Roberts developed a revolutionary, highly profitable theological framework that he called seed faith. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Here's exactly how the seed faith doctrine worked. Step 1. The Christian generously gives their hard-earned money to the evangelist's ministry. Roberts told his followers that this donation was not a gift, it was a seed being planted in God's soil. Step 2. The donor must have absolute faith that God will return to them a financial harvest far greater than their original donation. Roberts famously promised that any money donated to his ministry would be returned to the donor sevenfold. Step 3. When God supposedly rewards this faith with a job promotion, a windfall of cash, or an unexpected check in the mail, the Christian is then obligated to take that new wealth and give an even larger seed amount back to the ministry. It was a rinse and repeat cycle of extreme wealth extraction. Roberts fundamentally changed the nature of religious giving. He presented seed faith as a straightforward consumer transaction with the divine. If you were struggling to pay your rent, if you were drowning in medical debt, or if you were facing bankruptcy, Oral Roberts looked into the camera and told you that the only way to secure a financial miracle was to give him your money first. He weaponized the desperation of the American working class. He told his followers that sacrificial giving would render them immune from economic cycles, and that keeping their money during tough times showed a lack of faith. And the American public bought it. Unconditionally. Through the relentless promotion of seed faith, the Oral Roberts Evangelistic Association exploded into an unimaginable corporate empire. By the early 1980s, Roberts was sitting at the head of an organization pulling in $120 million a year. He employed 2,300 people. He didn't just have a church, he built a massive university, a medical school, and a hospital complex sitting on 50 acres of prime real estate valued at $500 million. He lived a life of astonishing luxury, shielded by the impenetrable tax-exempt status of the church. And the psychological tactic he invented, seed faith, became the absolute bedrock of the modern megachurch economy. Today, some of the wealthiest pastors in America, including Joel Osteen and Kenneth Copeland, trace their theological and financial roots directly back to the teachings of Oral Roberts. Alongside this massive financial evolution, the very DNA of the church was mutating. As the money poured in by the millions, the old ways of running a local parish simply could not keep up. Boards of directors became formalized, staff positions multiplied aggressively. The preacher was no longer the only man in charge. Suddenly, media directors, specialized finance officers, tax consultants, and high-level event coordinators became absolutely essential components of these expanding operations. The church had completely shed its skin. It was increasingly resembling a Fortune 500 corporation, a carefully managed, highly protected enterprise that required logistical oversight and aggressive strategic planning. But unlike a Fortune 500 company, these organizations operated in a complete regulatory vacuum. Because of the IRS 501c3 loopholes, the millions of dollars flowing through the mailrooms of Rex Humbard and Oral Roberts were never subjected to public scrutiny. There were no mandatory Form 990s. There were no public disclosures of executive compensation. The blueprint was set. The pioneers of the 1950s and 60s had successfully merged the emotional power of the gospel with the unlimited reach of mass media, creating a tax-free revenue stream, the likes of which the world had never seen. As the calendar turned toward the 1970s and 1980s, the primitive black and white television cameras would be replaced by global satellite networks. The million-dollar empires were about to become billion-dollar conglomerates, and the men running them were about to realize that when you have millions of desperate people believing your words are the literal voice of God, there is absolutely no limit to what you can ask them to buy. The mechanism. To understand how the modern megachurch industry legally hides billions of dollars in plain sight, you have to understand the rulebook. Or rather, you have to understand the terrifying reality that for this specific group of millionaires, the rulebook simply does not exist. If you or I decide to start a secular charity tomorrow, let's say we want to feed the homeless in our city, or fund research to cure a childhood disease, or rescue abandoned animals, the United States government requires us to operate with absolute, uncompromising financial transparency. You are legally mandated, under penalty of law, to file a massive, highly detailed document with the federal government every single year. It is known as the IRS Form 990. The Form 990 is the ultimate public equalizer. It is the bedrock of trust between a charity and the American public. This document forces a nonprofit organization to publicly declare exactly how much money came in through donations, exactly how much money went out to fund actual charitable programs, and, most importantly, exactly how much the executives are paying themselves. Anyone with an internet connection can go online right now, look up the Form 990 for the American Red Cross or the Make-A-Wish Foundation, and see exactly where the money goes. This transparency prevents fraud. It prevents executives from treating donation money like a personal, unregulated piggy bank. But if you put a cross on the front of your building and call your corporation a church, the Internal Revenue Service puts on a blindfold, turns around, and walks away. Under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, churches are automatically granted tax-exempt status. That part is well known. But what the general public does not realize is that unlike every other secular nonprofit in the country, churches possess a legally protected superpower. They are explicitly, federally exempt from filing a Form 990. They do not have to report their total income. They do not have to report their operating expenses. They do not have to disclose how much their lead pastor is being paid, what kind of luxury cars the church is leasing for their staff, or how many multi-million-dollar private jets they own and operate. It is a legalized, federally protected financial blackout. Stop and imagine the scale of this for a moment. We are looking at an industry that takes in an estimated $100 billion annually from American citizens, and yet there is absolutely no federal mandate for them to prove where a single dollar of that money actually goes. When a CEO of a secular charity uses donor funds to buy a $10 million mansion or a private plane, the Form 990 catches the financial discrepancy. Investigative journalists report it, the state attorney general investigates, and the public is rightfully outraged. But when a megachurch pastor does the exact same thing, the money simply vanishes into the dark. There is no paper trail for the public to follow. But the Form 990 exemption only protects the church's corporate bank account. How do the pastors manage to protect their own personal wealth from the taxman? How do these men and women live in 15,000 square foot mega mansions without paying the massive federal income taxes and local property taxes that normal American citizens are forced to pay? For that, we have to look at one of the most controversial, heavily lobbied loopholes in the entire United States tax code. A loophole known as the parsonage exemption. To truly understand how this loophole was weaponized by the modern megachurch, we have to trace its origins back over a century. We have to go back to the Revenue Act of 1921. When the parsonage allowance was originally codified in 1921, it was designed with a very humble, highly practical purpose. In the early 20th century, many rural congregations were incredibly poor. They simply couldn't afford to pay their pastors a livable cash salary. So, to compensate the pastor, the church would build a small, modest house of parsonage, usually located right next to the church building, and allow the pastor to live there, rent-free. The United States government, recognizing the financial struggles of rural clergy, decided that the value of this church-provided home should not be counted as taxable income. As originally enacted, this exclusion applied only to in-kind housing provided directly to ministers. It did not apply to cash. It was a simple accommodation to keep poor preachers from going bankrupt. But in 1954, everything changed. During the sweeping revision of the Internal Revenue Code in 1954, Congress made a massive alteration to the law under Section 107. Heavily influenced by religious lobbying during the post-war religious boom, Congress didn't just allow pastors to live in church-owned houses tax-free. They added a brand new provision, Section 107, subsection 2. This new rule stated that a minister could receive a direct cash rental allowance paid to him as part of his compensation, and that cash would be completely excluded from his gross income for federal income tax purposes. Let the magnitude of that legal shift sink in. Under Section 107, a megachurch board of directors, which is often handpicked by the pastor himself, can officially designate hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars of a pastor's salary as a housing allowance. As long as the pastor uses that cash to furnish a home, pay a mortgage, pay real estate taxes, buy luxury furniture, or even pay for utilities, that money is completely scrubbed from their gross income. They pay zero federal income tax on it. And the most shocking part of this 1954 revision? Unlike almost every other tax exemption in the federal code, there is absolutely no strict hard dollar monetary cap on this allowance. It is limited only by the fair rental value of the home. So, if your home is a $20 million mansion, your tax-free cash allowance can be astronomically high. According to estimates from the Joint Committee on Taxation, this single exemption costs the United States government roughly $700 to $800 million in lost tax revenue every single year. Take a look at this property. This isn't the home of a Wall Street hedge fund manager. This isn't the compound of a Silicon Valley tech billionaire. This is the official residence of Louisiana televangelist Jesse Duplantis. It is a staggering 35,000 square foot mega mansion located in St. Charles Parish, just outside of New Orleans. To put that into perspective, the average American home is about 2,200 square feet. This estate features over 22,000 square feet of primary living space and nearly 13,000 square feet of accessory areas, including massive multi-car garages and expansive outdoor entertainment patios. Duplantis himself has proudly claimed from the pulpit that the home cost roughly $20 million to build. If a normal, hard-working American citizen owned a $20 million home in Louisiana, their annual property tax bill would be absolutely devastating, approximately $122,000 every single year, payable to the local government. But according to local property records, neither Jesse Duplantis nor his ministry pays a single cent in property taxes on this palatial estate. How is this legally possible? Because the mansion is technically owned by Jesse Duplantis Ministries, which allows them to classify the entire 35,000 square foot compound as a church parsonage. In the eyes of the law, this $20 million luxury fortress is treated exactly the same as the humble, drafty wooden houses built for poor rural preachers back in 1921. And Duplantis is far from the only televangelist exploiting this system to its absolute limits. Welcome to Tarrant County, Texas. Sitting perfectly on prime, highly coveted lakefront real estate is an 18,279 square foot mansion. It features sweeping architectural designs, luxury amenities, and sits secluded behind a heavily guarded perimeter. This is the home of Kenneth Copeland, widely considered to be the wealthiest prosperity gospel preacher in the world, with a reported net worth hovering around $750 million. Copeland doesn't hide his wealth, he flaunts it. In a 2015 sermon, Copeland actually stood on stage and boldly told his congregation that God personally instructed him to build the mansion, claiming the Almighty told him, "It is part of your prosperity." In 2020, Tarrant County appraisal districts valued this massive estate at nearly $10.8 million. Under normal circumstances, the property taxes on a home of that magnitude would be financially crushing for any citizen. But because Copeland's mansion is legally classified as a church parsonage under Texas Tax Code Section 11.20, the residence itself is entirely tax-exempt. By classifying his luxury lakefront estate as a parsonage, Kenneth Copeland avoids paying an estimated $150,000 in property taxes every single year. Let that sink in. That is $150,000 a year that is not going to Texas public schools. It is not going to local fire departments. It is not going to fix the roads. It stays in the pockets of a man worth $750 million. But the manipulation of the legal code goes even deeper than the house itself. You see, lawmakers in Texas aren't completely blind. The Texas tax code specifically restricts parsonage tax exemptions to only 1 acre of land. You can't just buy a 100-acre ranch and call the whole thing a parsonage. However, Kenneth Copeland's massive lakefront property sits on nearly 25 acres of prime real estate. So, if the parsonage exemption only covers the house and the 1 acre it sits on, how does he avoid paying massive taxes on the remaining 24 acres of highly valuable lakefront land? His legal team simply files for an agricultural exemption. By placing a few grazing animals on the property, or claiming the land is used for agricultural purposes, the surrounding luxury estate land is suddenly taxed at a fraction of its actual market worth. By combining the religious parsonage exemption for the mansion and the agricultural exemption for the surrounding land, the tax evasion is practically absolute. In a recent tax year, records showed that Copeland's multi-million-dollar church empire owed a laughable 37.89 cents in property tax for dozens of acres of adjacent Texas land. He doesn't just live in a tax-free mansion. He lives on a masterfully engineered, tax-free compound. This isn't just an isolated issue with 1 or 2 famous preachers. It is an epidemic of hidden wealth. A massive investigation conducted by the Houston Chronicle looked into this exact loophole. What their journalists found was absolutely staggering. In the state of Texas alone, they identified nearly 3,000 parsonages worth a combined total of $1 billion. And these aren't modest homes for struggling neighborhood priests. These are McMansions built on exclusive country club golf courses. They are sprawling estates in heavily guarded gated communities. They are luxury properties perched on private, highly desirable lakes. By heavily exploiting the parsonage exemption, these religious leaders are legally starving local governments of an estimated $16 million in tax revenue every single year in Texas alone. And remember, that is just one state. Multiply that across the entire country, and the numbers become almost incomprehensible. As the old economic saying goes, one person's tax exemption is another person's tax burden. The everyday working-class taxpayers of America are essentially subsidizing the multi-million-dollar estates of the wealthiest preachers in the country, picking up the tab for the public services that these empires refuse to pay for. Now, you might be wondering, if this loophole is so blatantly abused, has anyone ever tried to stop it? The answer is yes, and the megachurch lobby fought back with terrifying financial force. In 2013, an organization called the Freedom from Religion Foundation filed a major federal lawsuit against the ears. They argued that the clergy housing allowance was blatantly unconstitutional. They argued that it violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment because it provided a massive financial benefit exclusively to religious ministers, while denying that exact same tax break to secular workers. And at first, the legal system agreed. In 2013, a federal judge in Wisconsin struck down the parsonage exemption, ruling that it was, in fact, unconstitutional. For a brief moment, a shockwave went through the megachurch industry. The billion-dollar loophole was about to be slammed shut. Pastors across the country were staring down the barrel of massive retroactive tax bills that could have bankrupted their empires overnight. But the religious lobbying machine kicked into high gear. Millions of dollars were mobilized to fight the ruling. They launched aggressive appeals. Finally, in 2019, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals overturned the lower court's decision, ruling that the exemption was constitutional because it supposedly didn't advance religion, but merely accommodated it. The loophole survived. The mansions remained tax-free. And the megachurches learned a valuable lesson. Their financial structures were practically untouchable. At this point, you are probably screaming at your screen, okay, maybe the law allows the housing allowance. But what about the private jets? What about the personal enrichment? Why doesn't the ears just audit them to make sure they aren't breaking other rules? Why doesn't the government step in? Because the megachurch lobby has ensured that the ears is practically powerless to stop them. If the ears suspects that you or I are cheating on our personal taxes, they can initiate an audit with a simple push of a button. If a secular charity is suspected of fraud, the ears can demand to see their books immediately. But the laws protecting churches are entirely different. In 1984, Congress passed the Church Audit Procedures Act, heavily restricting how and when the ears can investigate a religious organization. Under these federal regulations, a standard ears agent cannot simply decide to audit a church. The law dictates that a high-ranking Treasury official specifically, an official no lower than the Director of Exempt Organizations Examinations, must explicitly prove a reasonable belief of a tax violation before they can even begin an investigation into a church. It is an incredibly high, almost impossible legal hurdle. And here is the genius of the entire system. Because churches are completely exempt from filing the Form 990, they leave no financial paper trail. The ears has almost no documents to look at to establish that reasonable belief in the first place. It is the perfect, impenetrable catch-22. The ears cannot investigate a megachurch without proof of wrongdoing, but they cannot get the proof of wrongdoing without an investigation. The mechanism is flawless, the wealth is hidden in plain sight, and the American taxpayer is left footing the bill for the infrastructure that supports it. But hiding the money from the government is only half the battle. To keep the hundreds of millions of dollars flowing in every single year, these empires have to keep their followers opening their wallets. They have to keep their congregations under complete psychological control. And to do that, they use a dark, deeply manipulative psychological playbook. The victims. Up until this point, we have looked at the megachurch economy from the top down. We have looked at the massive, sprawling mansions. We have looked at the untouchable legal loopholes. We have looked at the corporate boardrooms, the private jets, and the billions of dollars hidden safely away from the eyes of the United States government. When you look at it purely as a legal structure, it almost feels like a victimless crime. It feels like a brilliant, if highly unethical, manipulation of the tax code. But there is no such thing as a billion-dollar empire without a foundation of human cost. Megachurches do not generate money by selling a tangible product. They don't manufacture cars, they don't build smartphones, and they don't drill for oil. Their entire financial empire is built on a single, continuous action, convincing millions of working-class people to willingly hand over a portion of their income. And they don't just want your disposable income, they want the money you need to survive. To keep the private jets fueled and the massive stadium lights on, these organizations cannot rely on casual generosity. They have to engineer absolute, uncompromising psychological devotion. They have to create an environment where giving money to the church feels more urgent, more necessary, and more critical than paying the rent, buying groceries, or paying for life-saving medication. How do they do it? How do you convince a grandmother living on a fixed Social Security income to send you $200 a month while you live in a $20 million tax-free compound? You do it by weaponizing the deepest, most primal vulnerabilities of the human psyche: fear, desperation, and the desperate desire for a miracle. Welcome to the dark, highly calculated machinery of religious extraction. The first weapon in their psychological arsenal is the algorithm of desperation. While the famous televangelists on the screen act like they are speaking to you spontaneously through the power of the Holy Spirit, the reality is that their fundraising operations are backed by sophisticated data mining and marketing algorithms that rival Fortune 500 tech companies. Behind the scenes, the largest prosperity ministries operate massive direct mail and digital marketing empires. And they don't just send letters to everyone. They buy demographic data. They purchase mailing lists from third-party data brokers. They specifically target demographics that are statistically the most vulnerable: the elderly, the recently widowed, the chronically ill, and individuals drowning in credit card debt. They know that a person who is financially secure and perfectly healthy is highly unlikely to send $50 to a televangelist. But a person who has just been diagnosed with terminal cancer? A mother who is facing foreclosure on her home? An 80-year-old widower who is terrifyingly lonely? Those are not just viewers to the prosperity gospel machine. They are highly qualified leads. Once a vulnerable person makes their very first donation, even if it is just a $5 bill stuffed into an envelope, they are immediately entered into the ministry's database. And the psychological bombardment begins. The victim will begin receiving letters in the mail, sometimes multiple times a week. These letters are masterfully engineered pieces of psychological warfare. They are designed to look deeply personal. They use specialized computer fonts that mimic blue handwriting. They use digital mail merge software to insert the victim's first name directly into the paragraphs, making it seem as though the millionaire pastor sat down at his mahogany desk and personally wrote a letter to an 80-year-old woman in Ohio. But it's the language of the letters that is truly terrifying. They rely on manufactured urgency and spiritual extortion. The letter will typically claim that the pastor had a specific, urgent vision from God just for you. It will claim that God is about to unleash a massive financial blessing or a miraculous physical healing directly into your life. But there is a catch. There is always a catch. The letter will state that in order to activate this miracle or to release this blessing, the victim must demonstrate their faith by sending in a specific amount of money, a seed, within a strictly enforced time limit. They will say things like, "The Holy Spirit told me you must send $77 within the next 3 days," or "the window of blessing will close forever." This creates an intense, artificial panic. To a desperate person, this isn't just a fundraising letter. This is a ransom note for their future. If they don't send the money, they believe they are actively disobeying God, and that their financial ruin or their physical illness will be their own fault for lacking faith. And if you think these letters are just harmless junk mail, you drastically underestimate the scale of the deceit. Let's look at one of the most infamous, highly documented cases of this exact predatory system in action. Let's look at the empire of Peter Popoff. In the 1980s, Peter Popoff was one of the most famous faith healers in America. He packed massive auditoriums, performing seemingly impossible miracles. He would walk through the crowd, point to a total stranger, state their full name, their home address, and the exact medical condition they were suffering from. The crowds would weep in astonishment. It appeared to be undeniable, absolute proof of divine power. Until 1986, when a team of skeptical investigators brought a radio scanner to one of his revivals. The investigators intercepted a hidden radio frequency. They discovered that Popoff was wearing a tiny, concealed earpiece. His wife, Elizabeth, was sitting backstage, reading information off of prayer request cards that the audience had filled out before the show. She was transmitting the names, addresses, and illnesses directly into his ear via a radio transmitter. He wasn't hearing the voice of God. He was hearing the voice of his wife, reading off a cheat sheet. The scandal was massive. Popoff was exposed on national television by Johnny Carson. His ministry collapsed. In 1987, he was forced to declare bankruptcy. The world assumed that the fraud was over, and that Popoff would fade into disgraced obscurity. But they underestimated the sheer profitability of the American megachurch economy. Less than a decade later, Peter Popoff quietly rebuilt his empire. But this time, he didn't need massive arenas. He didn't need to risk being caught with an earpiece. He simply weaponized the United States Postal Service and late-night television. Popoff launched a massive, relentless infomercial campaign targeting a very specific demographic, Americans who were drowning in debt. He offered them a free, miraculous solution. All they had to do was call a toll-free number, and he would send them a packet of miracle spring water. The infomercials featured testimonials of people claiming that after they received the free water, they mysteriously received checks in the mail for tens of thousands of dollars. To a person facing eviction or bankruptcy, it was an irresistible lifeline. Hundreds of thousands of desperate people called the number to get their free miracle. But the water wasn't the product. The water was the bait. By calling the number, the victim was giving Popoff's ministry their name and home address. They were willingly adding themselves to the database. And that is when the psychological nightmare truly began. Once a victim received the water, they were bombarded with a relentless series of personalized, highly manipulative direct mail letters. Popoff would send them bizarre trinkets, a red string, a packet of holy dirt, a paper cross, and instruct the victim to perform specific, almost superstitious rituals. Sleep with a red string under your pillow. Put the paper cross in your empty wallet. But the final instruction in every single letter was always the same. You must send the trinket back to Peter Popoff. Accompanied by a check, often for specific amounts, like $27 or $31. The letters warned that if they did not send the money, the miracle would be aborted. God would pass them by. Did this absurd predatory scam actually work? According to financial disclosures that investigators managed to uncover, in a single year, Peter Popoff's Miracle Water direct mail empire brought in over $23 million. He paid himself and his family millions of dollars in untaxed executive compensation. He drove luxury cars. He bought a multi-million-dollar mansion in California. He built an empire of extreme wealth by systematically draining the bank accounts of the poorest, most desperate, and most gullible people in America one $27 check at a time. But it is not just the elderly who fall victim to this system. The prosperity gospel has a far darker, far more dangerous side effect. Because when you teach a congregation that giving money to a pastor guarantees a physical miracle from God, you are no longer just playing with their finances, you are playing with their actual lives. One of the most devastating consequences of the modern church economy is the exploitation of the sick and the dying. In the twisted theology of the extreme prosperity gospel, physical illness is not viewed as a biological tragedy. It is viewed as a spiritual failure. It is framed as a lack of faith, or a demonic attack that can only be broken by, you guessed it, sacrificial financial giving. When a member of a prosperity megachurch is diagnosed with a terminal illness, like stage 4 cancer, they are incredibly vulnerable. Modern medicine offers them brutal chemotherapy, radiation, and terrifying statistics. The televangelist on the screen offers them something much more appealing, a guaranteed miraculous cure directly from the creator of the universe. The pastors promise that if the sick person plants a massive financial seed, if they empty their savings account, if they give away the money they were going to use to pay for their hospital bills, God will honor their extreme faith and eradicate the disease. And so, the victims give. They give everything they have. They write massive checks to the ministries, believing they are literally buying their own lives back. But biology does not care about theology. The cancer spreads, the disease worsens, and when the victim inevitably asks the pastor why the miracle hasn't happened, why their thousands of dollars didn't cure them, the system reveals its ultimate, horrifying cruelty. The system never blames the pastor. The system never admits that the theology is a fraud. Instead, the blame is turned entirely back onto the dying victim. The pastor will tell them that they didn't have enough faith. They will tell them that they must have a secret, hidden sin in their life that is blocking the miracle. Or, most chillingly, they will tell them that their financial seed simply wasn't large enough to demonstrate true faith. The victim is left bankrupt, dying, and completely convinced that God has abandoned them because they weren't good enough. It is a level of psychological devastation that secular financial scams simply cannot replicate. You might ask, if this system is so predatory, if it bankrupts the elderly and exploits the dying, why don't people simply walk away? Why do they keep giving? The answer lies in one of the most powerful psychological traps ever discovered, the sunk cost fallacy. When a person has given 10% of their income to a church for 20 years, when they have sent thousands of dollars to a televangelist hoping for a miracle, admitting that it is a scam is psychologically impossible for most human beings. To admit that the pastor is a fraud is to admit that you have wasted decades of your life. It is to admit that the money you could have used to send your children to college or to pay off your mortgage was stolen from you by a man in a tailored suit. It is to admit that the God you thought was talking to you was just an algorithm designed to drain your bank account. That realization is too painful to bear. So, rather than face the terrifying truth, the victims double down. They keep watching. They keep believing. And they keep writing the checks. The psychological prison builds its own walls. But, what about the people on the inside? What about the staff members, the associate pastors, and the accountants who work behind the walls of these massive empires? Surely they see the fraud. Surely they see the millions of dollars being funneled into private estates while the congregation struggles to survive. Why don't they blow the whistle? Because the modern megachurch has adopted the most aggressive, ruthless corporate legal strategies on the planet to ensure absolute silence. In a secular corporation, if a CEO is embezzling money or exploiting employees, whistleblowers can go to the press or the authorities, protected by federal law. But the megachurch industry operates by a different set of rules. Today, almost every major prosperity church and televangelism empire requires its employees, its volunteers, and sometimes even its high-level church members to sign incredibly strict non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs. Sometimes they disguise these legal gag orders with religious language. They call them covenants of peace or honor agreements. but their function is purely corporate. They legally forbid anyone on the inside from ever speaking publicly about the church's finances, the pastor's behavior, or the internal operations of the ministry. If a staff member realizes that the miracle letters are being generated by an algorithm, or that the pastor is using church funds to fuel his private jet for a family vacation, they cannot speak out. If they do, they are threatened with massive, ruinous lawsuits by the church's high-powered legal team. But the NDAs are only the legal threat. The spiritual threat is much worse. Inside these empires, loyalty to the lead pastor is equated with loyalty to God Himself. Staff members are routinely taught the doctrine of touch not God's anointed. This toxic ideology claims that the lead pastor is chosen directly by the Almighty, and that anyone who questions his authority, his spending, or his theology is actively rebelling against God. Whistleblowers who try to leave these organizations are not just fired. They are spiritually excommunicated. They are slandered from the pulpit. Their friends inside the church are ordered to cut off all contact with them. They lose their jobs, their community, and their entire spiritual support system in a single day. They are crushed by a billion-dollar machine that uses the name of God as a corporate shield. The megachurch economy is a fortress. It is protected by impenetrable tax laws on the outside and ruthless psychological and legal manipulation on the inside. It extracts billions of dollars from the most vulnerable citizens of society, promises them the world, and leaves them with nothing but empty bank accounts and shattered faith. For decades, this machine operated flawlessly. It seemed completely invincible. But no empire, no matter how wealthy and no matter how heavily guarded, can hide its secrets forever. The cracks were bound to form. The egos of the men running these empires were bound to grow too large. And when the walls finally began to collapse, the scandals that spilled out would shock the entire world. The climax and collapse. When you operate an empire entirely in the dark, shielded by impenetrable federal tax loopholes, and protected by corporate non-disclosure agreements, it is incredibly easy to feel invincible. When tens of thousands of people are cheering for you every Sunday, and millions of dollars are pouring into your mailroom every week, you begin to believe that the rules of gravity simply do not apply to you. But history has proven, time and time again, that a foundation built on deceit, psychological manipulation, and unchecked financial greed cannot stand forever. Eventually, the egos grow too large. The financial lies become too complex to balance. The whistleblowers inside the walls finally break their silence. And when a billion-dollar megachurch collapses, it doesn't just quietly close its doors. It implodes spectacularly, leaving a trail of shattered faith, federal indictments, and bankrupt victims in its wake. To understand how the modern church economy cracks under its own weight, we have to look at the three most devastating downfalls in the history of the industry. Our first collapse takes us back to the undisputed kings of the 1980s televangelism boom, Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker. In 1974, Jim and Tammy Bakker launched a television program called the PTL Club from a modest former furniture store located in Charlotte, North Carolina. PTL stood for Praise the Lord. What started with half a dozen friends quickly exploded into a bona fide broadcast phenomenon, eventually reaching an average audience of 12 million viewers. The Bakkers became incredibly rich and powerful, leading a life of conspicuous consumption that was perfectly aligned with the prosperity gospel they aggressively preached. They dined with presidents, bought luxury vacation homes, and traveled first class with a massive entourage. But Jim Bakker didn't just want a television studio. He wanted to build a kingdom on earth. Bakker directed his ministry to build Heritage USA, a staggering 2,300-acre Christian theme park and ministry center. This was not a modest retreat center. It featured a 163-foot water slide, massive shopping complexes, and luxury accommodations. It was so successful that it actually became the third most visited attraction in America, trailing behind only Disney World and Disneyland, drawing an astonishing 6 million people a year. But to build a theme park that rivals Disney, you need an unfathomable amount of cash. And although the PTL organization appeared to be flush with money, the grandiose ideas and lavish lifestyles of the backers were hemorrhaging cash faster than their flock could write checks. So, Jim Bakker engineered one of the most brazen financial scams in the history of American religion. From 1984 to 1987, Bakker and his PTL associates began heavily marketing and selling lifetime memberships to his television audience. The pitch was simple. If a donor was willing to hand over $1,000 to the ministry, they would be entitled to an annual 3-night stay at a luxury hotel at Heritage USA for the rest of their lives. Thousands of faithful viewers, believing they were investing in a divine mission and securing a vacation home for their families, mailed in their $1,000 checks. But the math was a massive, deliberate lie. The PTL organization oversold exclusive partnerships that vastly exceeded their actual physical capacity, raising more than twice the money needed to construct the building. In fact, tens of thousands of these memberships were sold to the public, but only one 500-room hotel was ever actually finished. Federal prosecutors would later claim that Bakker deliberately oversold 43,000 memberships, utilizing the PTL network to cheat people out of their money, while actively diverting $3.7 million to his own personal use. Furthermore, Jim kept taking $3, $4 million in personal bonuses, even as the ministry itself could not financially support its own operations. But the financial house of cards was about to be blown over by a much darker, much more personal scandal. Reporters for the Charlotte Observer had begun investigating PTL's increasingly murky finances. During their digging, a devastating bombshell dropped. The reporters discovered that a massive payoff of $279,000 had been secretly made to a woman named Jessica Hahn. Jessica Hahn was a former church secretary at PTL, but she wasn't just an employee. Hahn alleged that Jim Bakker and a former PTL co-host had essentially drugged and raped her. To ensure her absolute silence and protect his television empire, Bakker used the church's own tax-exempt PTL ministry funds to pay the $279,000 hush money, utilizing an associate to facilitate the transaction. To hide this horrific misuse of church donations, Bakker, who controlled PTL's financial decisions, allegedly kept 2 sets of accounting books to completely conceal the irregularities from auditors. The revelation of the hush money cover-up and the sexual misconduct caused an immediate, catastrophic implosion. In May of 1987, Bakker was formally dismissed as a minister, and he resigned from the PTL ministry. The fallout was absolute. Donations declined sharply in the wake of the scandal, and the remaining members of the PTL board eventually resigned, stating that rebuilding the ministry was impossible. But the federal government was not willing to let Bakker quietly walk away. On August 21, 1989, Jim Bakker went on trial in federal court. For 5 weeks, the American public watched in shock as the depths of the PTL fraud were laid bare. The trial culminated in Bakker's prosecution and conviction on 24 counts of fraud and conspiracy. The man who had promised health and immense wealth to millions of faithful viewers was stripped of his empire, convicted of federal crimes, and sent to serve nearly 5 years in a federal prison before eventually being paroled in 1994. The PTL scandal was supposed to be a wake-up call. It was supposed to serve as a permanent warning about the dangers of unchecked religious power and zero financial transparency. But the megachurch industry didn't learn to be more transparent. They just learned how to hide the deceit more effectively. As the decades passed, the aesthetic of the megachurch evolved. The public became suspicious of men in expensive suits crying on television. The new generation of believers wanted something raw. They wanted something edgy. Enter Mark Driscoll. In the late 1990s and 2000s, Mark Driscoll built Mars Hill Church in Seattle, Washington. He was a firebrand, often referred to as the cussing pastor because of his brash, controversial, and highly confrontational preaching style. His ministry of breaking conventions and his characteristic punk rock spirit called to a generation of young men and women who were disenfranchised with traditional cultural Christianity. Under his leadership, Mars Hill experienced tremendous, explosive growth, expanding into a massive multi-site network. Driscoll's stated goal was to build a church of 50,000 people and a media platform capable of reaching millions. But behind the edgy, modern branding, Mars Hill Church was operating under a culture of profound psychological terror, spiritual abuse, and pathological control. To build an untouchable empire, you must first eliminate anyone who can tell you no. As Mars Hill grew, its church bylaws were rewritten more than once. In November 2007, a massive reorganization took place. The new bylaws completely eliminated traditional church oversight and checks on Mark Driscoll's authority, installing him and a few select allies as executive pastors who controlled the board of directors. When other pastors and elders within the church attempted to question this aggressive consolidation of power, they were ruthlessly crushed. One pastor was fired for allegedly displaying an unhealthy distrust in the senior leadership, while another was removed for verbally attacking the lead pastor. But Driscoll didn't just fire his critics, he weaponized the congregation against them. Church leadership formally instructed the members of the Mars Hill congregation to actively shun the fired elders, treating them as unrepentant sinners. Members who openly questioned or dissented with Mars Hill leaders were asked to leave the church entirely. This practice of spiritual abuse, manipulation, and coercion created a culture of absolute fear. People were terrified to speak out, knowing that if they crossed Mark Driscoll, they would not only lose their jobs, but their friends, their community, and their spiritual family would be ordered to cut off all contact with them. And with absolute power secured, the financial manipulation began. Mark Driscoll wanted to be a best-selling author, but instead of letting the public decide if his books were worth buying, he simply used the church's tax-exempt bank account to buy his own success. Investigations later revealed that Mars Hill Church paid a marketing company called Result Source an astonishing $200,000 of the church's money to fraudulently boost his book sales. They utilized a complex scheme of bulk purchasing to artificially inflate the sales numbers, successfully manipulating the system to get Driscoll onto the coveted New York Times bestseller list. Furthermore, the church created a missionary-oriented offering fund known as Mars Hill Global. Congregants donated money believing it was going to fund international missions, but investigations revealed that the bulk of the money was actually being used to cover local Mars Hill expenses. It was a staggering lack of financial transparency. But unlike Jim Bakker, it wasn't the federal government that brought down Mark Driscoll. It was his own people. By August of 2014, the abuse and the scandals had reached a boiling point. A letter presenting formal charges against Mark Driscoll was signed by 21 former Mars Hill pastors. Additionally, 9 active pastors serving at the time asked him to step down from ministry. At the end of September 2014, an official investigation conducted by the church elders concluded that Driscoll was guilty of bullying and patterns of persistent, sinful behavior. The elders crafted a specific restoration plan, desperately trying to help Driscoll repent and save the crumbling church. But men who build empires do not submit to restoration. Instead of accepting accountability, Mark Driscoll declined the restoration plan entirely, and he resigned. Without the charismatic personality holding the dictatorial structure together, the entire empire evaporated. Shortly after his resignation, the massive Mars Hill network completely dissolved. Millions of dollars in infrastructure, tens of thousands of members, and a decade of explosive growth imploded practically overnight. It was a masterclass in how spiritual narcissism and the pursuit of Christian celebrity status inevitably destroy the very institutions they build. But if Mars Hill was a regional disaster, our final case study is a global catastrophe. A scandal so massive, it stretches across 6 continents and involves private jets, leaked financial documents, and international cover-ups. Welcome to Hillsong. Founded in 1983 in the suburbs of Sydney by Brian Houston, Hillsong originally started as the Hills Christian Life Center. But over the decades, Brian Houston transformed it from a local Australian church into a global cultural powerhouse. By 2020, Hillsong was operating congregations on 6 continents and claimed a staggering average weekly attendance of 150,000 people. They were a multinational corporation disguised as a charismatic megachurch. They produced chart-topping music, sold mountains of merchandise, and attracted A-list Hollywood celebrities to their front rows. But this global enterprise required a massive workforce, and Hillsong's preferred method of staffing was exploiting the faith of its own congregation. The church relied heavily on what former members repeatedly described as free labor. In one infamous moment, founder Brian Houston stood on stage and proudly announced that volunteer teams had arrived at 5 o'clock in the morning, working all day for no pay. The culture demanded that volunteers sacrifice everything to protect the Hillsong empire. And while the volunteers worked 15-hour days for free, the executives at the top were swimming in unimaginable, unregulated wealth. The sheer scale of Hillsong's financial mismanagement was hidden for years, protected by Australia's basic religious charities laws, which allowed them to operate under a veil of secrecy without publicly reporting their financials. But in 2023, the veil was ripped away. An independent whistleblower leaked thousands of pages of financial documents, and Australian Parliament member Andrew Wilkie presented the devastating findings directly to the government. The whistleblower alleged that the directors of the Hillsong Church Australia Group had engaged in serious financial and governance misconduct, including fraud and improperly using their positions to gain personal advantages. The documents revealed that Hillsong was moving unreasonably large amounts of Australian tax-exempt income overseas. Why? To fund the extravagant lifestyles of overseas celebrity megachurch pastors. The whistleblower alleged that Hillsong was using this tax-free money to make large cash gifts to founder Brian Houston and his family. In previous years, the Houston family had already been accused of enjoying a lavish lifestyle, practically entirely tax-free, utilizing church-funded vehicles and massive expense accounts. The leaked investigation also pointed to the church extravagantly spending money on luxury purchases, while simultaneously claiming government grants, including accusations of financial misrepresentation for the purpose of receiving JobKeeper grants during economic downturns. The financial rot was staggering. But just like PTL and Mars Hill, the money was only a symptom of a much deeper, much more toxic leadership culture. The collapse of the Hillsong empire began in New York City. Carl Lentz was the ultra-cool, highly famous lead pastor of Hillsong Nice. He was known for baptizing pop stars and building Hillsong's East Coast branch into a massive success. But in late 2020, Lentz was abruptly fired. The church leadership, including Brian Houston, publicly denounced him, citing an adulterous affair and what Houston described as narcissistic behavior and lying. An independent law firm investigated Hillsong Nice and uncovered a culture rife with sexual misconduct and abuse. Brian Houston stood before the world and apologized for the crisis caused by Lentz, claiming that Lentz was nothing like me. But Houston was hiding secrets that were far, far worse. In 2021, Australian police formally charged Brian Houston with a devastating crime, concealing a serious, indictable offense. The police alleged that Houston knew as early as September 1999 that his late father, Frank Houston, who was also a prominent pastor and the inspiration for Hillsong, had indecently assaulted at least 9 young boys in the 1970s, some as young as 7 years old. Documents tendered to the court allege that Brian Houston failed to alert authorities, deliberately concealing the information from the police to protect the church's reputation. While Houston was ultimately found not guilty in court of the criminal charge of concealment, the revelation that the founder of the world's most famous church had known about horrific child abuse for decades and handled it internally shattered the trust of the global congregation. And then, his own personal conduct destroyed whatever was left. Just 2 years after publicly denouncing Carl Lentz for moral failures, Brian Houston's own indiscretions were exposed. The church board was forced to admit that Houston had engaged in inappropriate behavior with two different women. The first incident involved an inappropriate text message sent to a female staff member, which resulted in the woman leaving the church and receiving a financial settlement equivalent to a couple of months' salary. The second incident occurred following a Hillsong conference. The church board revealed that Brian Houston had spent 40 minutes in a woman's hotel room. The leadership blamed the incident on Houston being under the influence of alcohol, mixed with anxiety and sleeping medication. To make matters worse, Houston was also arrested in the United States and eventually sentenced to 3 years of probation after pleading guilty to driving under the influence of alcohol. The sheer volume of the scandals was too much for the empire to sustain. Less than a week after the board released the statement regarding the hotel room incident, Brian Houston, the man who built the global Hillsong machine, resigned in absolute disgrace. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Multiple U.S. church campuses split entirely from the Hillsong brand, refusing to be associated with the toxicity. In early 2023, following accusations of extravagant spending and fraud, Hillsong was forced into aggressive cost-cutting methods, accepting voluntary redundancies from 153 staff members to save close to $10 million. The church's annual report revealed a devastating reality. Due to the endless stream of controversies, Hillsong's revenue plummeted by $17 million, a catastrophic drop of almost 20%. The invincibility of the modern megachurch was finally broken. Jim Bakker, Mark Driscoll, Brian Houston. 3 different eras, 3 different brands, 3 spectacular collapses. When you look at these downfalls, it is easy to view them as isolated incidents, the tragic results of a few bad men who lost their way. But that is exactly what the megachurch industry wants you to believe. They want you to believe these are anomalies. But they are not anomalies. They are the inevitable, unavoidable result of a financial and legal system that has zero oversight. When you combine the psychological desperation of a congregation with the impenetrable darkness of the IRS Form 990 exemption, corruption is not just possible, it is guaranteed. The men in the tailored suits may occasionally fall from grace. They may go to prison, or resign in disgrace, or fade into obscurity, but the system, the loopholes, the billion-dollar machinery, that survives. It just waits for the next charismatic face to take the stage. The conclusion. We have spent the last hour pulling back the heavy velvet curtain on one of the most powerful, untouchable, and unregulated industries on the face of the earth. We have traced its roots from the modest, black and white television broadcasts of the 1950s to the technologically advanced, billion-dollar global empires of today. We have looked at the brilliant, terrifying alchemy of the prosperity gospel, a psychological weapon that turns human desperation into tax-free corporate revenue. We have examined the obscure, heavily lobbied tax loopholes that allow men and women to live in $20 million mansions while paying absolutely nothing to the communities they inhabit. And we have seen what happens when the egos of the men running these empires finally collide with reality. When you lay it all out, the private jets, the NDAs, the agricultural tax exemptions, the miracle spring water, the offshore accounts, and the ruined lives, you are forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality. The modern megachurch economy is not a spiritual movement that accidentally became wealthy. It is a highly optimized wealth generation machine that uses spirituality as its corporate shield. And the ultimate tragedy of this entire system is not just financial, it is the absolute audacious hypocrisy of it all. If you look at the foundational text of the Christian faith, the contrast is almost entirely unrecognizable. The historical Jesus of Nazareth was a man who famously lived in absolute poverty. He owned no property. He rode into Jerusalem on a borrowed donkey. He explicitly warned his followers that it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. In fact, the only time in the entire biblical narrative where Jesus is recorded as displaying physical, violent anger is when he walks into the temple and discovers that men have turned a place of worship into a marketplace. He flips the tables of the money changers. He drives them out with a whip. He accuses them of turning his father's house into a den of thieves. 2,000 years later, the money changers are back. But this time, they aren't setting up tables in the courtyard. They own the entire building. They own the broadcast network. And they have a team of corporate lawyers to ensure that no one is ever allowed to flip their tables again. They have taken a religion founded by a carpenter who had no place to lay his head and twisted it to justify 18,000 square foot lakefront mansions. They have taken a message of ultimate, selfless sacrifice and monetized it into a monthly subscription service. Now, it is absolutely critical to make a distinction here. This documentary is not an indictment of faith itself. It is not an attack on the millions of Americans who find genuine hope, community, and purpose in their religion. Across the United States, there are tens of thousands of small local churches operating on shoestring budgets. There are local pastors who drive used cars, who visit the sick in the hospital at 2 a.m, and who use their meager church offerings to run local food banks, battered women's shelters, and after-school programs. These small congregations operate with genuine transparency. They publish their budgets on the bulletin board in the hallway. They are the actual hands and feet of charity. And those small, honest churches are actually the greatest victims of the megachurch billionaires. Because every time a televangelist buys a new private jet, every time a megachurch pastor is caught laundering money or covering up a horrific abuse scandal, the public trust is shattered. The cynical, unregulated greed of the billionaires at the top poisons the well for the honest people at the bottom. Furthermore, the tax burden that these massive empires avoid is shifted directly onto the shoulders of everyday citizens. When Kenneth Copeland avoids paying $150,000 in local property taxes on his luxury compound, that money vanishes from the local school district. It vanishes from the local fire department. The working-class families in his county, including the ones who don't even attend his church, are forced to pay higher taxes to subsidize his luxury lifestyle. So, where do we go from here? How does a society fix a broken system that is defended by the First Amendment and backed by billions of dollars in lobbying power? The answer is simple, but executing it will require a political miracle. The United States government must demand the exact same transparency from religious organizations that it demands from every other charity in the country. The total blanket exemption from IRS Form 990 must be abolished. If a church is bringing in $5 million, $50 million, or $500 million a year, the American public has a fundamental right to know where that untaxed money is going. If a pastor is truly doing the work of the Lord, if the money is truly going to feed the poor and heal the sick, then they should have absolutely nothing to fear from a public balance sheet. True charity operates in the light. Only thieves demand total darkness. Secondly, the 1984 Church Audit Procedures Act must be repealed. The Internal Revenue Service cannot be handcuffed by impossible legal standards that prevent them from investigating blatant, obvious financial fraud. And finally, the parsonage exemption must be capped. While it is perfectly reasonable to allow a small tax break for a rural preacher living in a modest church-owned home, it is a profound insult to the American taxpayer to allow multi-million-dollar estates, sprawling compounds, and luxury penthouses to be classified as tax-free religious sanctuaries. But until the laws change, the ultimate power to stop this machine does not rest with the ears. It rests with you. The megachurch economy relies entirely on your trust, your desperation, and your silence. If you are watching this, and you are part of a church that refuses to show you its financial books, leave. If you are sitting in an auditorium and a man on a stage tells you that God's healing, God's protection, or God's love can be unlocked by sending a check to his P.O. box, walk out the door. If your pastor lives in a gated mansion while telling you to empty your savings account to prove your faith, recognize that you are not being pastored. You are being targeted. Faith is a deeply personal, incredibly powerful force. It has the power to inspire billions, to comfort the grieving, and to change the world. But the moment you attach a price tag to a miracle, it is no longer faith. It is an industry. And it is time we finally audit the industry. If you made it to the end of this hour-long investigation, I want to say thank you. Documentaries like this take hundreds of hours to research, write, and edit, and they are frequently suppressed, demonetized, or targeted by the very massive organizations we just exposed. The only way the truth gets out is through you. If you found this investigation valuable, please hit the like button right now. It is the single best way to tell the YouTube algorithm to push this video out to millions of other people who need to hear this message. I want to hear your thoughts. Have you ever encountered the dark side of the megachurch industry? Do you think the ears should force churches to file a Form 990? Let me know down in the comments section below. I read as many as I possibly can. If you want to support this channel and ensure we can keep doing deep dive investigations without relying on corporate sponsors, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We have massive, highly requested investigations coming up that you will not want to miss. Until next time, keep your eyes open, question everything, and follow the money. I'll see you in the next video.